I'm guessing everyone's tired. Do people online hear me? Is everything okay online?
Okay.
Everything is okay?
Everything.
Okay. So this was the first title of the talk. I have given that talk before, and I will show you some parts of it. But I thought that the title RLB Rewards kind of deserves something a little bit more. Maybe someone can tell folks there that there is a talk. So yeah, I thought maybe I'll talk a little bit about something a little bit more historical before I jump into the RL parts of things the way that we normally do. So if you ask somebody who works in animal behavioral research, and you ask them what is RL or what is reinforcement learning, they don't even necessarily call it RL. You will get a very different answer than what we will give. And this happened to me recently at a conference, and I really felt like I'm meeting someone from history, even though the gentleman who was talking to me was younger than me. He was trained in a very old tradition where reinforcement learning meant reward shaping, so putting rewards in a particular way so animals learn certain tasks. The rewards that they use are rewards that have physiological salience or biological salience. They have a function for some physiological need and survival. So it could be food, water, etc. And they explore, they have often like very kind of strange dynamics in them that we don't see in our kind of RL. Now, here we have a framework where an agent takes actions in an environment to maximize expected discounted rewards. Rewards are usually explicit numerical values or states, often scalar, simplistic, and abstracted rewards. We have some better things, but now I wanted to take a look at this historical root of this kind of discipline that we are in, which actually starts in the 1800s, in the late 1800s. As early as 1864, at least to our knowledge, and probably if you look back, it goes back thousands of years, and others have said this, learning as a process of trial and error became a kind of a part of a scientific jargon. We have Thomas Huxley, who wrote in 1864 that Darwinian evolution offered the conception of a method of trial and error as a mode of learning. For Huxley, the origin of species showed that perceived intelligence in organisms' apparatus serving a certain purpose should be explained as the result of a grave shot, which hits something and the rest fall wide. Trial and error, in other words, was a very unintelligent way it was the way in which an unintelligent organism gained the appearance of intelligent behavior. You will note that this will ring through computer science's notions of machine learning for a very long time, and we will refer to, for instance, society of mind and other notions where there is kind of some stupid components that put together give rise to intelligent appearing behavior. I'd like to challenge that idea a little bit today. Hopefully by the end of it, we will have a conception of what would be the first steps towards something else. Now, 1900, and I mean exactly around 1900, the fin de siècle, exactly around that time that the century turns, this idea of explaining intelligence with unintelligence takes off even further. You have Loeb, who claimed living organisms are machines, and this is important because this is a kind of foundation of a lot of different work. Recently, this has been a lot more challenged than before. The whole notion of functionalism and the whole idea of mind machines have been like a lot more challenged. And then we have Morgan, who proposed a canon, a methodological guidance for studying the mental evolution of faculties. And he would use the word starting from the lowest kinds. And he had this imperative that you should always use the lowest explanation for animal behavior, which was a very reductive understanding of animals, human, and also later on human behavior. If you think about Minsky's Society of Minds, it's very much rooted in this kind of late 19th century, early 20th century idea that you have dumb pieces put together in a particular way appears intelligent. But over the past 15 years that I've worked with RL and neuroscience, the more I started understanding bacteria, I realized how much smarter they are than generative AI that we have today. They can sustain themselves for millions of years in one colony. They slow down their metabolism when the resource that they're consuming is ending. They can manage a very sustainable interaction. I think, if I'm not mistaken, some part of our kind of DNA is actually mutated with viruses even. So things that are so small as bacteria and viruses, extremely intelligent things. And these were the kind of dumb things that these kinds of ideas think are the building blocks of something smarter. And even something much smarter than these, they would consider dumb. Our brains are ecologies, every single, there are so many different entities inside. And in fact, if you look at the way each of them interacts or lives, none of them is really dumb. There is so much intelligence. And so I'd like you to consider that this might challenge some of that view, the kind of Minsky-esque views. So Morgan's canon explains intelligence with unintelligence. The bar for intelligence becomes extremely low. It just trial and error, doing something right after doing a bunch of trial and error, which is, as we know, model-free reinforcement learning, basically, is enough for something to be called intelligence. And this is where we are getting our ideas, some ideas of intelligence. It's initially only a mathematical method, but gradually became generalized as the nature of learning by the late 19th century, and as we know, still to the 21st century. By the 1920s, this idea became accepted in psychology that much human as well as animal learning proceeds in the method of trial and error. This downgrading of intelligence, there was a strategy of Watson and Loeb where they would show how behaviors that are interpreted as showing the use of higher faculties, which is like human reason or Morgan's notions of intelligence, can actually be shown as much simpler physiochemical reactions for Loeb and reflexive reactions for Watson. Loeb called these elemental reactions automatic mechanisms. You can see where our terminologies that we are using down to today historically comes from. They opened the door to downgrading of intelligence and animal behavior, which were associated with the lowest faculties, as they would call it. It shaped the foundational conceptualization of intelligence by early behaviorism and J.B. Watson's idea that all human behavior is conditioning. So what are the hallmarks of behaviorism? Behaviorism emerged as the dominant research paradigm in animal psychology in the late 19th and 20th century. Its radical forms can be seen in John B. Watson that I mentioned, and the radical behaviorism of B.F. Skinner, whom you might know, which share a set of core ideas. And a part of this core idea is that to claim the status of science for psychology, behaviorism denies the relevance, if not the existence, of mental entities such as consciousness or eternal life, or replay or counterfactual reasoning, some things that even for us is completely accepted that machines should be doing too, or even concepts such as purpose. Behaviorism maintains that all behavior is generated in response to reinforcement by the environment. Excluding internal life, behaviorism adopts a methodology that supposedly only derives conclusions from observable behavior. And this is important, observable behavior. There are these jokes, some of them kind of, might not be topically appropriate, but there's this joke that when two people are dating, a behaviorist would ask the other, how was it for me? Because they don't have access to their own internal states, and it has to be behaviorally observed from the outside. So that's why I'm giving the title Out of Our Heads, because the idea is that intelligent behavior is basically shaped by the environment and is observable on the outside. Nothing is going on inside. So B.F. Skinner, rather than internal factors, his behaviorism treats external or environmental factors as the source of behavior. I think there's a wonderful paper that I saw on Twitter that is going to be at RLC as well, that talks about 3 dogmas of behaviorism, and I think the spotlight on environment was one of the notions that they were mentioning. This is related to that. So through observing the control exerted by the environment, Skinner wrote, we can examine the effect of the world within the skin. So that joke that I was mentioning. Third, behaviorism was a science of control. And this was not just, and I didn't put it here, but I will mention it briefly, because we did an extensive amount of historical research, which we haven't published, Because at the time I was like, oh, what's going to happen to my career if I publish this? Now I feel like it's okay to say these things. Watson declared behaviorism as a science of control, the goal of which is the prediction and control of behavior rather than understanding the motivations of behavior, because it was all about observing and explaining how the environment shaped it. For Watson, all human behavior was conditioning. You can also look at 1897 to look at similar ideas emerging. Pavlovian or classical conditioning, as you know, Pavlov's dog, you have a conditional stimulus, which is, for instance, food, and then you have some unconditioned one, which is, let's say, the bell, and then when you ring the bell every time you pair the two stimuli together, and gradually the bell itself makes the dog salivate. This is conditioning. So basically, Watson was saying all human behavior is conditioning all the way down. And as you can see, this is, model RL. Later, Skinner generalized this thesis to contend the inevitability of sociocultural shaping or conditioning of human behaviors, which implies that we cannot choose a way of life in which there is no control, but we can change the controlling conditions with the help of behaviorism. Again, denial of internal life. We have nothing inside going on. Just to make it a little bit more light, this is a caricature of a dog saying, look what happens when I salivate. I make him jot things down. So he's just like reversing the cycle a little bit. Then one of my scientific heroes shows up. Tolman, who, as you can see from his age, he's living in the same time. So these are all contemporaries. In 1948, he summarizes 20 years of research he's done. At the time, he still is calling himself behaviorist, because that's what he's called, but he thinks he's redefining behaviorism to include internal life. The term that he uses for his experiment is latent learning, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. But he was trying to capture the fact that we are capable, animals, rats, are capable of learning the latent structure of the environment and having an internal model of it in the absence of rewards. That learning, it does not require reinforcement. And his classic latent learning experiment is in the Tolman maze that went against the behaviorist dogma of the time. That's why I'm putting this maze here. And as you can guess, given the things I'm saying about ecology, that's why I'm showing a maze that is green. So cognitive maps, and as you can see, I'm changing the fonts now because this is sort of in the original talk that I wanted to give you. So I wanted to have that historical backdrop before I go into some of the things that I wanted to talk to you guys about. So learned representations of relational structures, that would be the sort of cognitive map. In Tolman's latent learning experiment, there's something simple happening. You have animals that enter the maze and then they navigate the environment until, with trial and error, they find the location of the reward. That's one group. Group two, enter the maze, there is no reward in the maze, so they just move around. If behaviorism is true, and without reinforcement, they can't learn anything, they should not be learning the structure of the environment. If behaviorism, at least in its extreme form, is not true, then we should expect that the second group, when you introduce a reward, would learn the path to reward faster than the first group because it knows the structure of the maze already. And that's what he observed. That is the famous latent learning experiment that became sort of the foundation of a cognitivist approach to psychology. In 1978, this is 30 years after his paper, Tolman's paper in 1948 called Cognitive Maps in Rats and Men, we have O'Keefe and Nadell publishing a book, The Cognitive Map in the Hippocampus. O'Keefe in rodents found that when the rodents were moving around, and these are like the trajectories of where the rodents are moving, there's a particular location that when they pass there, particular cells in the hippocampus are firing. So he called them place cells. Then there is another one, which is 30 years after that by the Mosers. And these are grid cells that they kind of tile the space in a particular way. They kind of activate a particular tiling and that has like a particular shape as opposed to a particular location. And that's an internal cortex. Together, they won the Nobel Prize in 2014 for finding the GPS of the brain, quote unquote. You can see how understanding so much about what is happening in this internal landscape is already moving so much further away from behaviors. Something that I have worked on is what is the structure of these representations? how is kind of these representations structured in the brain to simultaneously enable remembering what is going on, but also predict and plan the future? For those of us who have been in RL, one of the first ideas is, okay, model-based RL could be one of these things, and that could be a one-step map of the environment, which is very flexible, but is inefficient. If you're running away from a lion, or if you're trying to catch a prey so that you can feed your cubs as a lion, saying from experience, you're gonna have to be fast. You cannot wait to unroll every possible trajectory and then choose one. So it seems like biologically, we might want to look for something that at the moment of decision is faster at making the decision. Sometimes we can use that kind of one-step approach, but it's not always efficient to use that, especially in an ecological niche. Another option that I've been using for the past 10 years in my work or more is the successor representation and various forms of this idea. The simple idea that you can compress certain parts of these trajectories and kind of pre-bake these multi-step dependencies instead of having to roll them out. And depending on the horizon with which you are compressing this, whether it is looking further or looking back, this could really help you to compute faster. Turns out, and I hope to show you some of the results, I don't know how many of the slides I hid, but we find in the brain that this seems to be the case, especially at different scales. So different parts of the brain have different scales of this, and that really assists us to flexibly plan. The approach that I used in my work was always such that I would compare the behavior, I would just design specific behaviors, and I would compare the behavior of humans, in some cases my colleagues rodents, and different RL models on the same tasks. And then you choose the RL model that shows the right behavior, not just in terms of accuracy, but in terms of the kinds of errors, in terms of the latencies, the relational difference between the latencies or reaction times to them. And then once you have a couple of candidate RL models, then you can take a look at their representations and then take a look at neural representations using fMRI or electrophysiology and see whether those representations align. So that is one important way in which these non-behaviorist representation learning using RL, we have used it to understand behavior. This is kind of a summary of some of the papers that, some of the main papers that are published in this area. If you need this slide in order to take a look at some of them. The general idea is that this gamma parameter, or the scales of abstraction, scales along the long axis of the hippocampus that in the humans sort of in the middle of your brain on two sides. And then even larger gammas that go further away towards the directions of the goal is in your prefrontal cortex down to somewhere behind your forehead. So if these are the locations or the states that you're kind of navigating, you can see my mouse right here. You have the smaller ones, the intermediate ones, and the larger ones, and there is kind of a representational hierarchy between them. So when I talk about the shape of memory, this is what I had in mind. Another thing I would say about this is that this might be a general principle for memory organization, because we find that it captures in statistical learning in humans, in context and episodic memory in humans, a lot of the kinds of things that we don't get for free when we are building our models. And things that have been of particular interest of late, especially like episodic memory, seem to have these kinds of components in common. I had a recent Oxford University Press book chapter that really kind of, I try to go down to how sort of it can capture both episodic remembering and predictive representations. If you want to take a look. All right, let's take a closer look at the shape of memory if it was like a model-based one-step tabular map versus if it was this kind of multi-step map. On the left, you have one where you just, if this was your environment, and these dashed ones don't exist. That's just to show its demonstration for the kind of multi-step approach. But if you had this environment where you had 1 leading to 3 and leading to 5, then on the left, you would see the probability of transitioning to each state, given you started at a given state and took an action. And then you have separately store the vector of rewards for states and actions. And at the moment of decision, you would just have to iterate until you get your optimal value. On the right, you have a scenario where given a policy-dependent representation, you learn the successor representation, that is just simply the discounted expected future visitation. So it's a count-based method, especially if you're learning it using TD learning. So imagine TD learning, and I have a slide for that if people wanted to look at it. It's like TD learning, but instead of rewards, you just have adding a count, and you're updating kind of a row of this matrix, and you just have a one hot every time that you're visiting a particular new state. And instead of discounted value of the next state that you would kind of get in model-free RL, what you get here in this TD learning is the discounted future or successors of the new state that you're visiting. So in a way, when I'm visiting this state and I go into a new state, I don't only add one count to this, I also inherit all the future or successors of this state as well. In a given, or this state that I was in also inherits all the discounted successors of this other state as well. Okay, and it is fast. You can just do a linear combination of the sort of successor representation with a vector of rewards. But fun fact, the columns of the successor representation can simulate the place cells that I showed you, the place fields that I showed you earlier, and its eigenvector can capture grid fields that I showed you earlier. In addition, we showed in a paper that with a little bit of Laplace transform and just doing the inverse of the Laplace transform, which is the equivalent of having multiple SRs with different gamma parameters and getting a gradient with respect to the gamma between two, getting a derivative with respect to the gamma between two states, you can get the distance between them. Turns out the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex in different animals, including humans, they do capture also distance to goal. And so it seems like we have a kind of a shape for memory structure that with different mathematical acrobatics, it gives us different types of representations that are physiological. All right, I'm just going to say we showed that human behavior is closer to this kind of idea of successor representation plus replay. And I'm just going to say also that we repeated this with other tasks, compared it to original data, it was a lot more efficient. Tried out different kind of priority adjustment for replay and show that different representations can learn whether you're prioritizing replay with reward prediction error or transition prediction errors. This was the behavioral side that I told you. Then with kind of neuroscience, some of my colleagues showed that this also captures the behavior of rodents and not just humans. And with some depth electrodes inside patients, we show that this captures how the single cells change when they are navigating any kind of a VR maze. And in another work with Eva Bruneck that was published in the Journal of Neuroscience 2022, I think it was published, not 2021, we actually showed that these kinds of multi-scale representations are in the brain. But we also applied it to LLMs, but I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time and just go here. Okay. So we talked a little bit about what would happen if we take that kind of anti-behaviorist kind of Tolman to RL and then apply it further to sort of understand using reinforcement learning, what are the representations that allow us to navigate the world? Now, let's see what are the different ways in which RL has also expanded the concept of reward. One of them obviously is in the notion of hierarchical RL. A lot of people in the room have worked with it. Decomposing tasks into hierarchy of simpler, more manageable subtasks, allowing an agent to learn and solve each. Enhance learning efficiency, scalability, allowing the agent to build and reuse skills, etc. Count-based exploration method. I saw Marlos earlier, so I really appreciate his approach to this as well. The approach that I showed you, the successor representation, is also a count-based method, basically. And you have expected visitation count as opposed to reward. So usage, you learn the reward separately. And in sparse environments, it's very helpful because you can define just little bundles of places where with a count base, you figure out, oh, I'm going to end up here very often. And so you can change this notion of rewards to this notion of count-based exploration, especially when rewards are very sparse. They encourage diversity in exploration and discovery, options, eigenoptions, various things that you've seen Marlos and others do. They also, in representation learning and HRL, focus on how state visitation counts can inform the creation of better feature representations. We also have inverse RL, of course, where we infer the reward function from observed behavior, applications, obviously, in various things. text as reward. We have exploration of using text feedback as a form of reward as opposed to reward itself, which is obviously very directly related to DPO, direct preference optimization, to optimize directly based on human preferences. And some work that we did, which is interaction-grounded learning, no notion of reward and no notion of goodness or badness of action. You have to infer from the agent has to infer from the interactions with the environment. In this case, for instance, imagine you have an electrode or some kind of a device that needs to collaborate with a person, and there is no clear signal of what is good or bad there. And we showed that there are some ways that one could potentially, the agent could potentially learn in the absence of reward to interact better. Something that is very much less appreciated, I think, in the kind of the CS world and also perhaps in the neuroscience world, is this concept of homeostatic reinforcement learning that was proposed in 2014. As we know, the world doesn't come with reward labels, and inspired by biological systems that maintain homeostasis in an environment. The concept here is that the agent's goal is to maintain a homeostasis, some balance of internal states, its energy levels, its stress, dryness, food, sleep, rather than some scalar reward that is maximizing. And this is important. If you eat too much, you're not going to feel good. You're not trying to maximize food. You have to, you have to maximize it until it's kind of getting bad. Anything that we as biological creatures eat, it's not possible to just scale. If we think about growth, if we think about how fast, for instance, your child is learning or your child is growing its height when they're very young, you can't extrapolate that this growth can go forever. You can't extrapolate, okay, these are scaling laws of humans and my child is going to be 1,000 feet tall within this many years. We don't, because there is some kind of a homeostasis that happens at some point. What they do is very interesting. So you have this kind of a landscape. And so, for instance, here you have temperature, and this is going like up or down. And you have here, for instance, glucose. So this is, in this case, it's just temperature and hunger. And then you have some kind of a landscape where if it's very low, this might be a place where the organism is happy. In these corners, the organism would die. So you just want to avoid those corners. And your drive is based on that distance that you have between being in a better state versus moving away from that kind of homeostatic state. So in a very interesting and simple way, they're defining something that goes beyond just scalar rewards or even just the vector of rewards. And obviously this landscape is very simple, but I think we can have situations where this landscape can kind of be learned and also adapted and also new features learned. So maybe I didn't think temperature was relevant until climate change happened, and now I have to take it into consideration. This could be a new direction for intrinsic motivation, and also learning homeostatically relevant features and maximizing rewards. I just want to end with this idea, and this is the pie in the sky, it's 4 p.m. and we are all tired kind of idea, which I hope to pursue seriously. Something that really bothers me is the scale at which, and this does not represent the opinions of my employer, I think the scale at which we are employing AI in products right now is not responsible, first because it's not ready. As we know, there's so many failure modes and various kinds of issues. Force feeding it in every product, I think, is irresponsible to begin with. However, it is using a lot of energy and a lot of environmental resources. And I think incorporating some kind of a homeostatic idea of learning into the rewards for AI agents and some kind of ecological homeostasis or ecological equilibrium for them could be helpful. Because unlike us, they can indeed represent how much their can compute, how much what the computation it is that they're doing would contribute potentially. And I would love it if at some point GPT-4 says, it's not worth you asking me this question, use a calculator instead of asking me 20 back and forth, this is not good for the environment. I'd love it if it would tell that sometimes. As we know, search also with, for instance, Gemini is a lot more expensive than, I don't know what was the cost. Someone said 10 times. I don't know if that's correct. It was an article, who knows, more than the usual search that they had. Okay, so what if we had intelligence that, so it was similar to biological ones, like the bacteria that evolved to maintain some homeostasis, so regulate hunger, sleep, temperature, etc., maintain equilibrium with an ecology. So the grass, sheep, wolves ideas. If the sheep eat too much grass too fast, the grass will end before replenishing and the sheep will die. If the wolves eat the sheep too fast, the wolves end and the sheep end and the wolves would die. So there is some kind of an equilibrium that needs to be maintained. And it's not so easy. They're not doing this consciously. They're not like consciously computing this. They have actually evolved their internal landscape of their homeostasis and the ways that they respond to the environment has evolved in a way that it has learned certain things. And I think that is what I would consider ecological intelligence. In that light, and we come back to what I showed you historically in the beginning, animals, even bacteria, are smarter than, for instance, GPT-4, also in the sense of not destroying the habitat for all of us biological creatures right now. So maybe we can have ecological intelligence as one where the agent learns to maintain homeostasis in relationship with an environment. It was not supposed to say nice. I think at this point I just dropped the ball on that. But I wanted to write that an environmental niche. So there is an H that is dropping there. An environmental niche, and one where there is replenishing. There is some rate of replenishing, and one's internal landscape of homeostasis is adapting to the rate of replenishing of the reward factors in the environment. Zoom has passed out and it says connecting on my computer. So I think they must have, I can still see it here, but Zoom seems to have dropped me out. Oh, because I don't have a subscription, but that's okay. It's almost over. And they still hear me here. I don't have any more slides for people who are online. So ecological RL could potentially not just use scalar or vector of rewards. It could learn the shape of that kind of internal homeostasis. Oh, it's not even there. Okay. And it could learn to update this internal landscape according to the interactions with an ecology. It's a pie in the sky idea. I am going to try to make some efforts towards it, and I am hoping to write this paper, some aspects of which has been around in my mind, occupying rent-free for 3 years, and with the historical kind of research. And yeah, I hope to at some point move beyond both rewards and the behaviorist kind of legacy of RL towards that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. So,
yeah, I was wondering in terms of, so for instance, you were talking about the compressed multi-step sort of, and I imagine there's some sort of fairly straightforward intuitions, like, you know, if a particular trajectory is repeated often, then it gets compressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I was wondering if you have, you know, a lot of ideas beyond that in terms of sort of the kinds of priors. And then I have a sort of just a second question in terms of sort of connections to population-based rewards for the ecological and homeostasis stuff you know about.
Yeah. So thank you for asking that. In the meantime, I rejoined Zoom so I could potentially share relevant slides if need be. So yeah, so thank you for that question. The first thing I would say, you asked about multi-agent notions of reward space. At least that was one of the things that you were asking. So there was some research that I've done over the past, again, 10 years on what would be the graph structure of connectivity between different agents that is optimal for a particular task. It turns out, and we show this in some research, am I sharing this yet? So in some recent research, we've shown, and I think it might be further. We've shown that, for instance, it is not efficient to connect a number of agents in an all-to-all fashion in order to solve hierarchical exploration or hierarchical planning problems. It turns out it is much better to have them be connected to each other in smaller groups and then sometimes have dynamic connectivity. This had been shown in an experiment in 2016, also in humans. We've also shown in humans that, and in RL agents, deep RL agents, and now with multi-agent systems, If you want to maximize, for instance, the agreement, you want to have something that is more connected, has more connectivity. But if you want to solve some hierarchical problem or do innovation, you want to have sparse connectivity and then dynamically change that. And so there are some rules depending on what is the objective. And I do think that it is important, since a lot of people are, for instance, right now using multi-agent systems in an all-to-all way to solve all the problems, and that's both more expensive and less efficient. With regards to learning compressed representations, you asked whether if something happens very often, then it is more likely to have those kinds of compressed representations. I actually think that is the case, but I also think in addition to that, that this kind of notion of, let me put it here. So the more, so this would be sort of the just a simple TD learning that would learn these kinds of compressed representations. So every time you go to S and then you take an action and you end up in S prime, you can kind of update that row by taking the kind of one hot of S prime because one count of visitation plus discounted all of the row of S prime, but discounted added to this one minus what you had and alpha. So that would be like your success for prediction error. Obviously, the more you go and visit these states, the more you're going to, because of alpha and gamma, the more you're going to have a representation of longer term future. And the idea is that when an animal is navigating or when an agent is navigating, that entire row is available as the representation for the state S. And the more I have gone to a particular policy with this particular agent, then the more I will have a compressed representation of further into the future, depending on my gamma. Another interesting thing here that I think I have one thing about it, and I think perhaps it speaks to what you were talking about, is that the representation of a particular state, one way to think about it would be I'm only representing the state this animal currently is in this maze, and for some reason this rat likes money. And this location is in panel B, that is just one location, just where it is. So that's one way of representing. It could be just this one and what is just next, one step. Or it could be like this one, these two C and D are both successor representation, but because it's a policy dependent, and it goes to your question of repeating a particular policy, because it's policy dependent, if you were under the random walk policy or diffusion policy, what you would have is you should get this kind of gradient of representations going outside, basically. And how far it will go into the future will depend on your gamma parameter in this case, right? So you're standing here and the rodent is equally representing all the different paths, basically. And this is the equivalent of taking the inverse of I minus gamma t, t being the one-step model-based kind of. However, if you're learning under a very kind of goal policy, very goal-directed, very greedy policy, then you're basically ignoring everything else. And from this location, you're representing this path to reward in a multi-step way. So what you compress also depends on what kind of policy you're getting. Not only you were right that how often you go matters, but another thing that matters is the specific policy that you're choosing for the kind of internal representation that you learn. What we observe in humans, both in their behavior and in their fMRI, is that their behavior is more akin to kind of success representation, also because it's not just the bird's eye view. It is policy dependent. Our errors and a lot of our biases are related to that. Oh, there's one. Marlis at the end. Throw the. We need a ball microphone to throw.
Thanks for the talk. One thing that I was wondering, just like I really like the historical perspective that you gave about the behavior. And of course, when we talk about Pavlov and the dog salivating, we know that TD is a very good explanation of some of those behaviors. And it feels that if we think about the computational RL perspective of things, it feels that at the beginning, we were kind of trying to understand underlying mechanisms for learning. And then we're going to the simplest type of system and then going to explain them. But now when we look at, in a sense, what a lot of what's going on here in the field, it feels that we never got past that stage. So in a sense, neuroscience evolved and say, hey, we have different modules in our, I like to call it an agent architecture. We need to be thinking about an agent architecture, not necessarily just, I don't know, a neural network with a loss function. So One, I was wondering if you think that this is the type of thing that we should be looking at, like types of, like what would be the modules or the components of this agent architecture? And then just to go back to your ecological take on this, then I'm wondering if there's something different going on, which is just like, yes, wolves and sheep, they don't have a behavior that is going to destroy them. Well, and the reason for that is because if they had, they wouldn't be here. So we wouldn't even be talking about that. So how much of this is part of a learning mechanism? How much of this is just evolution in a sense, selecting the right parameters in that agent architecture such that they self-regulate? And it's not so much about redesign agents, but it's more about the fundamental question, like what types of reward functions should we be considering when we have a complete agent architecture?
That's a great question. I have an extra microphone here. That's a great question. So that would be better because this is a little. So it was multiple ones, and I'm really interested. I hope we can expand on it later. Just quickly, to your last point, just because the slide is already here. Yes, ecological intelligence evolves, and that's the first thing that I'm writing here, right? Intelligence evolved while biological creatures had to do certain things at this stage. In a particular ecological niche, right? You're right that some of them didn't survive, and some of them might have had even better algorithms, and they just didn't survive because a dumber, more aggressive one just killed them. So it's true that this is very much within the domain of an ecology and within a domain of evolution. But that means that it is not just the environment that shapes the agent, and it is not just one particular notion of rewards. There is some equilibrium happening, and there is identification, internal identification of certain homeostatic levels and external development or evolution of particular sensors and motor functions. There is this beautiful work, it's a phylogenetic work on the evolution of different kinds of learning. It goes back to kind of like very early on in evolution, where you only have creatures that can just go towards either random, and if they sense the kind of food, they just move towards it. So this was the most simplest version. Then gradually they develop fins so they can move around and they can explore actually. Then gradually they develop eyes, and then you'll have this explosion of diversity of biological creatures, because based on what they're sensing, different things start to pop up. And gradually, as their limbs and sensory and sort of different things increase, then they need to have an internal organs of controlling, or kind of somehow, not controlling, because actually it turns out that a lot of things don't need a centralized controller, but they need some kind of different kinds of internal actions that in all it does is to coordinate all of this different sensing, moving, different kind of needs. And as this kind of internal landscape starts to pick up on different features of the environment through vision, through food, through sort of different kinds of through sensing, through proprioception, then gradually you have more and more kind of diverse algorithms. And that's why I think if we are focusing on scalar rewards, we will not have that kind of explosion. It's not enough to say, oh yes, I added multimodal, because at the end of the day, the ways in which it's just maximize a particular function, it's still in that state. So I don't know what would be the way to get out of it. This is some ideas here. How would we account for evolution in our kinds of designs? Fortunately, we can observe what happened in evolution and maybe try out some of those. Which brings me to your second question, and I apologize for talking so much. It's late, and I think I'm rambling. So I did some work inspired by this kind of cognitive science work that I showed you, testing out multi-step reasoning and planning in LLMs. It turns out they're really terrible. This is like a lot of tasks in 5 different categories, different graphs, 6 different graphs. Turns out they're terrible, and turns out even GPT-4 is terrible. And in fact, the new one, and the more they kind of RLHF it seems to get worse at it. And there's certain failure modes and such. So something that I asked was, okay, what if we design some kind of a multi-agent architecture where the GPT-4 or LLMs, those were 8 LLMs we tested, they don't need to do the whole thing end to end, but they just play the role of one of the particular parts. So instead of thinking, oh, the dumb parts were the neurons or inside of this kind of architecture, and now we have this kind of transformer and it has to solve everything. Like, No, actually, the DOM component might be the entire transformer, and then we have to put the transformer together. And that's why I think the idea that it's the society of mind idea, it's dumb things that go together, that's not quite true. In fact, the atomic elements should be very smart or have intelligence. And what we did was indeed that, and we had these different kind of modules connected to each other in a particular way, and we ended up, and these are some results I didn't show, but we ended up improving the behavior a lot. We ended up on PlanBench, and we even did it with Llama. And Llama with this LLM POC approach, in fact, did better than GPT-4 with just in context learning, which is kind of great given it's, what, 20 times smaller in terms of parameters, I think. Yeah, and then we tried it on PlanBench, we tried transfer, and it turns out that it can even transfer between PlanBench things. So I'm going towards that direction right now to see sometimes maybe we can get just inspired by some modular architecture that has already evolved to solve a problem, and then use that in order to piece together something. I don't know if I answered your question. Sorry for rambling so long. I would love to follow up.
Let's thank you for your talk.
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, so after this, we have a poster session upstairs for like an hour or so. Please come by. And then after that, we'll have a social at 7:30. Please come to that as well. Thank you again for coming to this workshop. We hope you learned something about RLB on the boards and had a great time. Yeah. Thank you.